greater need for engagement. I don't believe that the era of engagement is over. The engagement is a must, no matter how or when. Even during the darkest days, we still need engagement. It may be a different channel, but we must keep the channel of communication open. I think I'm from Malaysia. I'm a Malaysian Chinese. And I think Malaysian we are well placed to act as a bridge because Malaysia is a confluence of four great civilizations: Chinese, Indian, Muslim, and the West. So we understand we have the best of the both worlds. We understand the East and West. So this is why I voted the idea of setting up this bridge. The West need to understand China more, as much as China need to understand the rules of how to engage the game, the rule of the game, how to engage with the West. I think it's important. So the more you engage, the more you understand each other, I think the world will be a better world, more peaceful. So as I said, we are very honored today to have two very distinguished professors in international relations to talk about, to enlighten us on how the post-Ukraine Russia conflict will look like. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Ho, for introducing the event and also for introducing the institution. And so our two experts today, let me start with Professor Brantly Mowack, sitting next to me. So Professor Mowack is the visiting Boeing Chair Professor of Global Affairs at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University, and currently an emeritus professor at the University of Virginia. He is a world-leading authority on China-U.S. relations, Chinese foreign policy, and grand strategy. He has held the CKEN chair at the Naval Center of the University of Virginia. He's also a Fulbright Scholar, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, Mellon Fellow, and a recipient of numerous research grants. He has also held honorary professionalships at Jinin University, right? And also at the East China Normal University. So he has served as a consultant to the U.S. government's national security issues, and has worked as a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So he has authored over 100 journal articles and book chapters. His current research interests include asymmetrical international relationships, the relationship of public authority and the popular power in China, foreign policy of Vietnam, and China's relationships with Southeast Asia. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Professor Zhu Feng is a well-known scholar and professor of international relations at Nanjing University in China. He holds multiple positions, including being the executive director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of South China Sea, and the director of the Institute of International Relations at Nanjing University. He is also a member of editorial boards of scholarly journals, consults independently for the Chinese government and private sector. And also he is frequently featured on television and the radio and in print media to comment on Chinese foreign affairs and security policy. And Professor Zhu writes extensively on regional security in East Asia, the nuclear issue in North Korea, and China-U.S. military and diplomatic relations. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my big pleasure.
Thank you. So, as we all know, that it's been a year since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So the theme today we're having now is rebalancing the global order after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I have so many questions for our two specialists. Now, let me start with a question for both of you. That in your opinion, right? So what are the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on global power dynamics and great power competition?
Well, no, after you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the impact, of course, is very multiple and even very, to be honest, intrinsically disastrous. First of all, when we see such a war, of course, launched by Moscow, it's a very relentless, violation of international norm and international law. It's a bigger powers, very bad behavior, conquering and invading a small sovereign state. So then by nature of the Ukraine war, I think there's no dispute. Moscow should be to blame. But on the other hand, we also see why Mr. President Putin is just take a great risk and just sending the troop into the Ukraine. And also now so far just reject to just withdraw all the troops. Then we will see the reason, of course, is very tricky. For example, NATO's east expansion, and U.S. laid some sort of, we say, such a geostrategic, pointing to Russia's, potential expansion or traditional sphere for influence. Finally, just lead to the, we say, such an outburst of Russia's, ancestors. But no matter how Russia could just legitimize its military action, I see there's little ground to get the international community see it will be possible, it will be reasonable. So then we will see, as long as so far the Ukraine was still fighting around, then a couple of the potential risks is still very, very, it seemed to me, very tellable. For example, there is any possibility the Ukraine war will be escalated into some sort of direct conflict between Moscow and Washington? Yes, by nature of the Ukraine war, it's very typical great power proxy war. But the problem is, if a proxy war couldn't just stop over the time as soon as possible, then we will see such a very disastrous, potential of risk, uprising couldn't be excluded. So therefore, I think the second thing is also very, very horrible. I mean, if the President Putin really just fully cornered, he will just risk a lot using the nuclear weapon. Then it will be, to be honest, it will be, we say, doomsdays of the world politics. If the President Putin dare and also desperate, just use the nuclear weapon. So then, so far, I see the Ukraine war is really, really a big, alarming, setting to the international community. Let's work together and help stop the war as soon as possible. But the tricky nature is still largely some sort of a proxy war. So U.S. just trying to get the war lasting longer and finally weakening it's a traditional strategic rival. It's a Russia. On the other hand, then we will see the European country also feel very, very compelled to defend their sovereign claim by supporting the Kiev and the Ukraine. So then we'll see a lot of complexity. Now it's really still very simmering around some sort of a Ukraine war. But anyway, I really hope whatever the Ukraine war will end up, it should be less damageable and converting, some sort of full, we say, left side change of the international politics. So that's why every time when I watch the war is going on, to be honest, my feeling has never been more heavy and disruptive.
Well, I completely agree with what Professor Zhu described, but it's my obligation as the second one to address this question, to be more optimistic. I think of the war in Ukraine as a major part of a general perfect storm in international relationships that's going on right now. It's the major part. It's Putin's major mistake, and Russia will suffer for that mistake. There's also the COVID isolation, not just international isolation, but that's a big part of it. And I'm so happy to be back in China for the first time in 3 years. And I think that the bridges, East-West bridges, are particularly important at the individual level as well as the international level. And it's made me feel better about U.S.-China relations to be dealing with real Chinese in China rather than simply reading about the China side of things. So the post-COVID, what COVID has done to isolate people and countries is something that we should keep in the back of our minds as one of the current problems. And a third problem is U.S. politics. You had President Trump and then President Biden not changing much from the new direction that President Trump took. Well, now for the good news. This we've talked about, this is an atmosphere, a bad atmosphere, a perfect storm, to use an expression sometimes, but even perfect storms do not last forever. So the question that I'm sure we'll be addressing during the discussion is, after the storm passes, what does the landscape look like? Mm-hmm. And the landscape is changed by the storm, but parts of the landscape will remain the way they were. And another thing is that a storm like that creates opportunities, not only for reconstruction, but for new construction. And I'm sure that these are types of things that we'll be addressing with your questions.
Yes,
so.
yes.
Yeah, one more point I want to add. I like the Professor Womack's great points, but the problem is, unfortunately, we see some sort of very, very negative side effects of Ukraine war is to get Americans more inflammatory in anti-China sentiments. So then that's also get me feel very frustrated. Originally, I see the Ukraine war could just provide the U.S.-China leadership some sort of a new international obligation. We can stand up and work together and get the things just well addressed. But unfortunately, the war finally keeps Beijing and Washington apart further. So then that's why I consider Professor Schwarzman mentioned very important. When we now is just falling into some sort of a very disturbing moment, I think since maybe most disturbing moment since the end of the Second World War, the great powers should stick together, re-engaging each other, rather than just keep the, we say, finger points to your face endlessly.
Right, I completely agree. And there's also important questions about not just third-party countries, but the rest of the world, which is larger than either of the global powers. Mm-hmm. And how will those relationships modify the negative effects of this growing polarization between the United States and China, and what opportunities are there for new leadership? So again, I'm taking an optimistic view, but optimists tend to be disappointed. But they also if anything gets done, it's done by optimists. So.
Yeah, I think the modification is definitely need a re-engagement.
Yeah.
Then I think it's also a high moment for the international community to reconsider some sort of very essential methodologies we employed in addressing such international disasters. So that's why I think, time has never been more pressing for Washington, for Europe, for China, for Tokyo, for ASEAN countries. We should just round up, having a very serious discussion so while we can work together.
Right. And beyond each country's national interest or perceptions, but trying to find the bridges, trying to find what holds things, what can bring things back together.
Yes.
Certainly there are diplomatic mistakes by both sides in dealing with the Ukraine crisis. Well, starting with Putin. I mean, I think even Putin's mother thinks the invasion was a mistake by now.
Yeah.
If she doesn't, she's not a good mother. Because for Russia, it was not only a failure, it was a mistake. but the failure makes it even more of a mistake. And how
Yes.
can it do anything to get out of that mistake? How can what settlement can be reached? How can it step back?
Mhm.
And then reconstruction of Ukraine, the damage in Ukraine that we've all seen on television.
It's horrible.
It's horrible, and this is something where China's great capacity for infrastructure creation and construction and things of that sort could be very useful in some post-crisis situation. So to get beyond crisis is certainly a major task for everyone at the present moment.
Thank you. Maybe just a follow-up question on the conversation just now about the U.S.-China relations. Professor Mowack, you mentioned in the article in the Chinese rise and U.S. Power parity and the recommendation of civilization published in 2007. That power parity is not that useful a concept to predict the future of China and the U.S. The most relevant question is how will the interaction be, right? And you said the future of U.S.-China relations is most likely to be a civilization, right? A process of conflict and reconsideration. Rather than a clash of civilization. So I'm wondering that what's your opinion, how do you think about the future construction of U.S.-China relations? And how do you think about your argument that you made in 2007? What do you think about it today?
Well, the article you're referring to was called Asymmetric Parity. So two countries, United States and China rising to the point of being the major concern for the United States, and the United States, of course, being the major concern for China. But both countries in totally different physical situations, relational situations, prospects, so it wasn't like two boxers in a boxing ring. It's symmetric type of parity. It's asymmetric. And China, China for the foreseeable future isn't going to reach the level of personal wealth that the United States has. On the other hand, with 4 times the population, it has already exceeded the gross national product in purchasing power parity terms. So this is this confusing situation, which is we've never seen the like of it before. And I think this is one of the things that really disturbs American perceptions. The types of tension the United States has. It's not only never faced a power like the United States before, but previous attempts at parity have been things like Germany in the Second World War. So that helps cause the fear. And you have the Thucydides trap, the famous Graham Allison thing. And why? I don't think when a parity is asymmetric, when China moves a step forward, it doesn't mean the U.S. is moving a step back. It affects proportionality in global politics, but it doesn't affect. It's not like I win, you lose. But that's very difficult for the current for the hegemon, for the United States, as its real control declines, to think, what is my future if I'm not in control? Okay, so to get back, my article was written right before Trump was elected president in the United States. So necessarily, I'm more pessimistic now than I was then. However, I think the basic argument holds. But what has changed is the psychology. And so the reality of the relationship is not a zero-sum relationship, but the psychology, especially in the United States, but that is reflected in Chinese psychology as well, is a psychology of if you rise, I decline. And the problem, I say, no, that's not necessary. But the problem is psychology is real.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about a reality, and this is just a misunderstanding of the reality. But if somebody misunderstands the reality, they can make mistakes that are real. And so we're in this mix of reality and anxiety, especially in the United States. But that has effects more generally. And then Putin doing a remarkably stupid thing that involves all of us in rethinking relationships complicates the matter.
Yeah, one point I want to add is this. I see Americans' way to handle a rising China, of course, is very controversial. But I see a lot of the roots now is very distinguishedly and also intrinsically just based on Americans' domestic politics. Yeah. So then when we see a lot of Americans' political and strategic elites just always believe what? Believe American exceptionalism. So why Trump was so critical to China? He always complained during his campaign back to the 2016. He said, why China just getting stronger? Because China stole Americans' technology, take advantages of Americans' openness, and also just make a good use of Americans' goodwillness to China. From this point, I think China just become totally sidelined as some sort of monster. But to be honest, my generation witnessed the entire China's great reemergence. It's the based on what? Based on the very, trackable the nature of China's great civilization. China people work harder than most of the people in the world. China is always just focused on family value, centered traditions. So parents' obligation is always bring up their children as well as they can. On the other hand, then obviously Chinese saving rates being highest in the world. So that's why I see, unfortunately, yes, power imparity remain very untouched between Washington and Beijing. US take a great lead over China on almost the fronts. Yes, China is getting stronger, but to be honest, much far behind the US. On the other hand, the Chinese strategic culture is we usually is a very pragmatic nation, and the people, we don't want to punch overweight because it will be very disastrous to us. But the problem is China's domestic political transition always will just empower some sort of Chinese politician to stand up if U.S. press and punching China very harshly and we say harder. So then from these points, I really hope some sort of real accurate examination of the power imparity could now just open the way for the both power to re-engagement. To be honest, I'm a very serious international relations scholar. There's no way for me to believe China become a very passing threat or passing competitor. So US still take a great lead over China in terms of the strategic competition ability. So then over the time, I hope, for example, the Ukraine crisis will be a very timely reminder, better controlled, managed relations between Beijing and Washington will serve our people and two nations at the best.
I hope so too. And I would add to that one of the asymmetric differences between China and the United States is China's very productive relationships with its neighborhood, with Pacific Asia, with Northeast Asia, with Greater China, with Southeast Asia, and keeping those relationships. That is the ground in which China has grown to being a global power, and it should not be distracted by U.S. opposition from taking care of that ground. That ground is essential to the stability of China's long-term prospects.
Yes.
So I just want to emphasize that. And it's not just a question of what China does, it's what China does where it is. And where it is in Asia.
Yeah, another point is my generation of Chinese still genuinely believe in the past 40 years since the China's reform and opened up back to 1978. From 1978 to 2018, U.S. served as the most positive and we say some sort of well-guiding, driving force, get China into the world community deeper, broader. So in many ways, we learn a lot. We take the Americans' hand and advance them our way. So that's why Americans' influence over the China's, advancements has never been bigger. And also we see such a touchable. So then if the US now is really just trying to decoupling China, demonizing China, one of the very disastrous results is, not just bring down most of Chinese, but we will believe. So what's some sort of the roles you really serve in getting the 1.4 billion people, biggest populace, country, just looking at the US. So then that's why I always just argue with my American colleagues, never overthrow your Americans, we say, looming such an attraction and attraction to the China for our future.
Very good.
The next question in regard to international norm and international institution, how do you assess, to both of you, how do you assess the role of these two in managing the conflict? And we talked about a reconstruction, and the landscape after the storm, right? And if you find it not that effective, then what are the measures that can we take to increase the effectiveness, to make it a key role in the afterwards, to really promote international peace and security? Yes.
Well, let's go back to the reaction of China and the United States to Putin's invasion. And I would say that both sides made a serious diplomatic mistake that has contributed to the tensions, the bipolarization that has resulted. China's mistake was not underlining its respect for sovereignty. From the first statement made after the invasion, China said China respects the sovereignty of other countries. But it didn't underline and say, and therefore invasions like the invasion of Ukraine is a violation of basic UN principles. And the US, for its part, ignored China's statement about that respect for sovereignty is the first principle. It's almost always the first thing that was said in China's statements. And it says, China is just siding with Russia. China's not, because China's not on our side, it must be on the Russian side. And so you have that initial, I don't know exactly how, the sort of inhibition in pointing, explicitly criticizing Putin's invasion on the Chinese side, and then the American disregarding the subtlety, the implicit, but very clear to anyone that was not trying to push China into a Russia camp on the American side, and how to get back from that. China's mediation of the Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization shows a commitment to peace, and the Chinese points on peacemaking in Ukraine and Xi Jinping's visit could be contributions. Perhaps those could be made more in conjunction with the rest of the world. The President Lula of Brazil is also pursuing very actively some sort of framework for peacemaking. And perhaps it would be a good idea for China to explicitly, I think Lula is going to visit Beijing pretty soon.
Yeah.
And I hope that they not only agree, I hope that they work together.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think how get the China-U.S. relations get into the soundtrack, I think it's very important. First of all, I think that both uh, politic, political figures and the leading political figures should have some sort of, we say, visionary views and methodology dealing with each other. Just simply keep complaining and condemning each other, totally useless. And also, well, just how say, fueling the fire between the either side, and finally just get our relations just how say, spiraling down into some sort of, we say, some sort of potentially very dangerous points. So then, besides that, I think the second is very important. Both media and think tank and scholars, we are also equally responsible. Just how say, setting some sort of positive views and terms in our way, and help both people in the community and the society to understand each other. I totally understand, for example, COVID-19 pandemic finally become the last straw, almost squashing the bilateral relations, because a lot of American people believe what's the COVID pandemic is China launched some sort of a third world war without firing a single missile. I can understand. So U.S. also got very, very, how say, harshly, affected by the pandemics, flaring. But the problem is we should get out of some sort of a pandemic dilemma. Of course, it's not a China, some sort of biological, wars vis-a-vis the U.S. On the other hand, we're also simply very sympathetic to some sort of a pandemic sufferings for the American people. So then I hope that over the time we can just watch out of some sort of pandemic trap. And now we should throw each other some sort of serious eyesight on our indispensable relations. Last one, I think, is very important. So then Beijing and Washington, we need to reinvigorate with some sort of all level or multiple level of contacts and the dialogues. No matter how we still disagree, but some sort of such a institutionalized, with a dialogue and communication could just how say gradually but firmly keep both government sticking again. So then I also hope to see some sort of such a new dynamic could just how say falling again.
Thank you.
Oh, very good.
Maybe one last question from me, and I'm going to open the floor to the audience. So we have talked about the impact more in terms of security, right? And how about economics, right? So what do you think is the impact of the conflict has imposed on global trade or globalization? And what are the ways out of this waves of economic sanction? When we're talking about the reconstruction after the storm. Of course, we need economics, right? So what are the ways out of it?
Well, I wish I knew the answer. But if I knew the answer, I would probably be more successful as a businessman. The economic problems, not just from the Ukraine war, but the economic problems of COVID, this storm. You look at the economic effects, the economic landscape and how that's affected by the storm. It's increased all sorts of the negative sides of all sorts of prospects that countries had before COVID, before Ukraine. Countries think of Belt and Road Initiative projects. Belt and Road Initiative, before that, people could imagine a future much like the present, only with this new infrastructure, with this new project. Now it's a future with the global economy more problematic, with food prices going up, with the debt from the initial investment in the infrastructure becoming more and more of a problem, and with the prospects of repaying that debt becoming more of a problem. So you get this situation where that progressive look of the outlook before COVID and before Ukraine has become, a curving down and a question of so what do you do next? But COVID as an economic problem in itself, I think, is passing. And so we certainly are more sober as a result of that. And we're more concerned about supply lines. We're more concerned about resilience is a bigger question in economic development than simply marginal advantage and marginal spread. So we'll have to make that adjustment. On the other hand, resilience requires relationships. Resilience is not simply pulling in. I think this is something that many American politicians don't understand. If they cut off relationships, they're actually cutting off relationships with other countries that can help in crises. And isolation is something that could be dangerous to the American privilege as a position of economic centrality in the world economy. Think of the dollar. If the dollar if the dollar loses its grasp as a global economy, a global currency, then the United States will have to work as hard as the Chinese in order to maintain the economy rather than to sell dollars, which are easy to produce.
Yeah, I think like economically, both Beijing and Washington has never been more just faced up some sort of such a great risk. The reason is U.S. now is attempting to decouple China and launching also high-tech wars vis-a-vis Beijing and banning the Chinese companies from any access to, for example, high-tech semiconductors. The Biden administration also now is setting a new tone very high. I mean, technology nationalism. U.S. should just getting a silicon curtain just falling down between the Beijing, Washington, Beijing. To be honest, I feel very sad because globalization is indispensable and also very essential, the norms to keep the world, community, just booming up. Everybody should recognize it's common sense. No power, no country could just set themselves out of some sort of such a globalization process. I understand. So in the past more than 1 decade, Americans elites complain a lot about China's domestic economic modeling. I mean, the model of China's economic development now is definitely just declared by the Washington, D.C. as non-marketing economy. So yes, just to feel China's some sort of centralization of power, also strengthening China's international competition and leave the American companies in some sort of unfair, ground. Yeah, no matter how the U.S. could complain about China's modeling, then we can just sitting together and get the Beijing more, serious in talk. But now Americans' China policy is very completely about face. It's not negotiating. It's just keep pounding the China. So then the risk is huge because the globalization also will be collapsed. So you can imagine, if a decoupling ultimately just take place, the world will be falling into different economic and geopolitical fragmentations. Then some sort of a bloc-based confrontation, even economically, also will be harder to just disperse waves. So from this point, I think that will be very, very disastrous prospect for the future's world. So then finally, I have to say the US and China should just, reclaim the globalization is indispensable norm. Both powers are also very tightly embraceful. Then let's just through some sort of a new round of talk and even we say tag out for wars in negotiation, then get our concerns well addressed rather than just pounding each other.
Well, I have to add a more optimistic note. And although it's a strange type of optimism for an American, I would say we should remember that the U.S. and China combined are 1/3 of the world economy.
Yeah.
There's 2/3 other, there's 2/3 with, and so if China doesn't, on its side, deglobalize, then the rest of the world, I'd say the strategic effect of American decoupling is going to be an self-isolation of the United States, rather than even a economic bipolarization. It'll be a self-isolation. U.S. will become a boutique economy. It'll have a hard time dealing with the financial implications of the dollar being less important. And if you look at the strategic implications of things like the restriction on the silicon wall, the silicon curtain, then I see these are major problems, tactical problems for the Chinese economy at the moment. But is there anything that China cannot buy now that in 10 years or 15 years it couldn't make itself? And I think back to space programs, because in 2011, the U.S. Congress, whose wisdom you've seen recently displayed in the TikTok hearings, decided that the National National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA in the United States, should have no contact with China. If you were working for NASA, you could not be in the same room with a Chinese space program. Well, as you see, it has destroyed the Chinese space program. The Chinese have trouble keeping a balloon up in the air. Well, they do a little bit better with satellites and trips to the moon and things of that in space stations, despite the lack of NASA. Well, cutting China off may feel good to Americans wanting to restrict China, but the ultimate effect is to be left out of continuing development in the rest of the world.
Great point, Professor.
We could clap here, but if this were Washington, they would not be clapping.
Thank you very much. So let's open the floor to our audience. Please introduce yourself, please, and also keep your question brief, and also please be specific which speaker your question is addressed.
Thank you so much. My name is Vasilis Trigas. I'm a research fellow at the Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University. So I have a question because it has to do with the resilience issue. That resilience is relationship. And, this is a Malaysian think tank, and Malaysia is a relatively small country compared to China and the US. So my question is about small countries in high politics, right? We've heard a lot from regional leaders from ASEAN, the following argument: do not make us choose, both to the Chinese side, addressing the Chinese side and to the American side. So how does this work out in the region? If you could give us, the question goes to both speakers, if you could give us a little bit of a strategic snapshot of Chinese relations with the ASEAN community and American engagement with the ASEAN community. And of course, the South China Sea is the big elephant in the room.
Yeah, good question. First of all, I have to rectify you on the point. Malaysia is not a small country. Malaysia is a very typical middle power. Yeah. Strategic snapshot to the East Asia, then we will see it's showing some sort of new dynamic. On the one hand, as I mentioned, the US just trying to organize some sort of geopolitical, geo-economical regroup, then get China well contained, and also keep China apart. So then we will see, for example, President Biden also launched some sort of very interesting idea. It's called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Initiative, and with the exclusion of China. But the problem is, as I mentioned, in the past more than 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, East Asia has been most prosperous and peaceful region around the world. So, but we say after the Second World War, just 30 years after the Second World War, East Asia was most dangerous, most frequent war-fighting region in the world. Why? What makes the distinctions between the two different time frames? Most important thing is China's open net, and we reset the strategic tone, and embracing some sort of a developmentalism. So then, when China back to the Maoist era, so China was also very ideologically driven. So then, where we see another very important factor behind some sort of such a new history of the East Asia is ASEAN. Also become a very successful regionalization organization in the East Asia. So then, of course, the US still maintain hegemonic, prestige in the East Asia. So then now when the US just declares strategic competition with China, in the America's policy narrative, China become number one biggest threat. So then US want reset the line, force the ASEAN to choose. So we feel very frustrated. But to be honest, how the ASEAN could refit itself into some sort of new great power competition. First of all, is not how the US forceful or just persuasive. It mostly depends on how China could respond in a very, very receptive way. So that's why I really hope China ASEAN, we could just share some sort of lasting vision. The East Asia will not be just risking losing the lasting prosperity and cooperation as long as we can stick in together. The second, of course, well, I also hope the Chinese government could just through out some sort of positive mindset. We could also address the ASEAN's concern in a more serious way. So if the both could just make a very smart adjustment, and then finally just rebuild some sort of East Asia community on, we say, shared future community building. And I don't think great power competition will finally just tear up the East Asia into the pieces. That's also serve the China's interest the best, and also serve the Americans' interest as well.
Well, since Professor Zhu has taken an optimistic view, it's my turn to take a pessimistic view, but I'm not pessimistic, actually. I agree with your optimism. But I think it's been a natural development of improved relations with China and ASEAN. But I don't think it's inevitable, and it's not inevitable that it will continue. It takes continued positive efforts on both ASEAN's part and on Southeast Asia's part, because Southeast Asia is not simply the institution of ASEAN, and on China's part. It is China, I think, has done, since the 1990s, China has done very well in its Asian neighborhood. And it's helped its neighborhood, and the neighborhood has helped China. But to keep that up remains a continuing challenge. If you want to see a country that has not handled its neighborhood well. Look at Russia. Russia, every neighbor of Russia is at arm's length at least from Russia, because it doesn't feel that Russia respects its interest. If you're Azerbaijan, or Kazakhstan, or Latvia, or whatever, it's not just you feel dependent on Russia, or you feel close to, you feel that Russia is too close to you. It's that you don't trust Russia to consider your interest. Okay, so now China has an infinitely better relationship in East Asia and Southeast Asia than Russia has with its neighbors. But to keep that up, I think China will have to take a step forward on things like on South China Sea. There's no way to get a sovereignty issue solved, but there's ways to contain that. The code of conduct on South China Sea is something, the individual points of that code of conduct don't matter. It's getting sovereignty off the front burner and getting to issues like fisheries management and resource cooperation, and basically getting the South China Sea off the front burner and the other types of relationships developed. The same goes for, I think there's been great progress on the Lancang Mekong area since 2016, when the foreign ministers have been meeting every year. Now, there's no sovereignty issue here, but very great differences of interest, not just between China and Southeast Asia, but between Cambodia and Vietnam. The river is very important to them. So how can the countries work together? How can China work together with Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia? This is the key, not what the United States does. The United States is already a minor part of the economies, and it's has heritage alliances with Philippines and Thailand, and it has something else going on with Australia, but it's still a situation where the United States is far off. No one in Southeast Asia right now would reasonably side with you, if it had to pick, side with the United States. But if China was saying you have to pick, then China becomes the threat. Okay, so avoid, can continue the current relationship, but improve it more.
Thank you. Maybe we will have time for one more question.
Okay.
My name is Wang Li, and I'm from Tsinghua University. And my question is for both the speakers about Taiwan. And I think one implication of the Ukraine crisis is about the future possibilities of Taiwan. Different sides like Beijing, Taiwan, or Washington DC are drawing different conclusions or implications from Ukraine on the future of Taiwan. So I want to know your ideas about it and what kind of consensus, common lessons that the three sides can learn from Ukraine crisis for the future of Taiwan.
Okay. Yeah, good question. So first of all, I think the Taiwan issue is completely different from the Ukraine issue, because Ukraine is a sovereign state. It's also a UN member state. But Taiwan is part of China. And I think most of the members of the international community has no disputes over China's some sort of claim. But the problem, the key challenge now is whether or not the Taiwan issue will be falling into some sort of such a vicious cycle of Asianized Ukraine crisis. To be honest, I'm less concerned. The reason is I don't think that will be serve the Chinese interest at any point. So we really want just to get the Taiwan issue well addressed, well managed. We don't want to overthrow the some sort of landscape of the Taiwan issue. So then I think the China's policy of Taiwan remain intact. We say peaceful reunification is at the top priority. Then of course, if the Taiwanese want to declare some sort of de facto, like independence, then of course there's no way China can back off. So military reunification probably become some sort of follow-up. If the Taiwan declare de facto, just I mentioned, independence. But now the most tricky nature of Taiwan's tension is, to be honest, when Americans' China policy changed, it's a Taiwan policy changed either. So back to the 1979, so Carter administration, very successfully and very nicely just struck the negotiation with the Chinese counterparts on normalization of our relations. Then American government also agreed the nature of the cross-Taiwan relation is unfinished territorial reunification. Taiwan is definitely both politically and in sovereign is part of China. But today, what's the Americans' policy of Taiwan? What's the Americans' policy narrative of Taiwan? The Washington now is just assume the Taiwan issue is some sort of new front where the U.S. led the Western democracy should just have to very bravely defend the Taiwanese for their liberty and democracy. So I'm very frustrated.
Yeah.
Oh. On the other hand, for a long time, the Americans' Taiwan policy by the government level, on the government level, is strategic ambiguity. I mean, it leaves the U.S. a lot of room to maneuver. But now the Biden administration trying to turn on to strategic ambiguity. So then all such things is really a very compelling, the things for Chinese. But to be honest, my view is that there's a lot of very deeply rested, the interest calculus behind the Americans' policy change. For example, just like getting the Taiwan issues increasingly unstable and more dangerous. It's the American success way to get to the TSM or some sort of Taiwan high-tech semiconductor companies just to move on to the U.S., investing heavily in the United States. So it's also some sort of part of American contaminated, as I mentioned, the silicon curtain between the two countries. Then second, I think the Taiwan issue become also some sort of a legitimacy test for U.S. or China to address the Taiwan issue. So then when the Taiwan issue become more ideologically, the Washington, D.C. believe China will be less grounded to address in any Chinese way. So I see it will become some sort of great fighter for legitimacy claiming the Taiwan issue. Now the human rights and the liberty replace the sovereign state and the sovereign some sort of reunification. So then, as I mentioned, China should keep the mind open and coming down. Don't just dancing with the rhythm of America's China hawks.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the major effect of the Ukraine invasion on Taiwan policy is not on China's side of the Taiwan policy or on Taiwan's side, but on the U.S. Seeing a resonance of Cold War resolution, and the Taiwan. If we successfully resist Russia, we can have a democracy and authoritarianism type of more ideologically based struggle, as Professor Zhu was saying. And I think that's extremely unfortunate for Taiwan, as well as for China, and also for the region. I think that one should recognize, and maybe this is another area, an avenue for policy development in China, and beyond simply peaceful reunification as a goal. Taiwan is an integral part of Pacific Asia. Its trade patterns, not just with China, but though that's its key connection with Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Korea. Taiwan is a success story in economic terms in Asia, and Taiwan is a part of China, and therefore China should be happy with its success. You know, it should not. So one thing China should avoid is the mentality that the U.S. is having toward China, of thinking, oh, I have problems with China, therefore it's better for China to stay low. It's better to restrict China. Don't restrict Taiwan, and praise its successes, you know, and help it develop. The most successful thing in the peaceful reunification policy since 1979 has been the opening up of the cross-strait relationship. And the government of Taiwan resisted that. It was the merchants of Taiwan that forced the government beyond its no policy of the 1980s. And, you know, to keep those types of relationships, bilateral relationships, but why not add a dimension of that, of Taiwan, you're doing well, you know, and add that to the mix. And Taiwan, you're doing well in a region that's doing well, and a region that it now is its center of attention is China.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we got. Do we have one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes.
okay. I think it's so short. Can I go back to you? Okay, I just think it's very short. I'm Simona from Tsinghua University as well. I did have a longer way I wanted to phrase my question, but I'll start firstly with this is a refreshing conversation. Truly, we are so lucky to have, I think, people traveling back here. It brings fresh perspectives, and these are the kind of ideas we need to share. So thank you for policymakers in Washington on how to potentially reduce this now. And to Professor Zhu, what would be your recommendations on how potentially the two
可能会在一定程度上对于“一带一路”产生一定的影响。所以我的问题是，那这种影响具体表现的哪些方面？那我们的国家应该如何去应对？
Sure. I will maybe keep the question translation short. What do you think are the impacts of the conflict on the back?
Well, whatever. What I say when I'm in the United States, which is normal, is that the global South, the developing world, is very much underappreciated in the prospects for the United States global leadership, such as it remains, and global presence. In 2008 was a major year for many things, for the global financial crisis and other things. There's one thing that tends to be overlooked because the statistics didn't come out until later, and that is that in 2008, the economies of developing countries exceeded the GDP of developed countries for the first time since the 19th century. So the global South is larger as a productive unit than the global North. And it has interconnections. You know, it's not a hub and spoke global economy anymore. And if the United States doesn't adjust to the fact that it needs to, that its influence requires the appreciation of common interest rather than simply domination, then, you know, and control because it's in the middle, then it loses power. And then the power seeps away. And to quote to give an instance of that, there was a Summit of the Americas held in Los Angeles in summer before last summer, and the United States tried to exclude Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela from the conference, and tried to manage everything. It was a total failure as a diplomatic conference because the United States was not listening. It was telling. It was not listening, and it was presuming on its position rather than justifying its central position. So that's my comment on that.
Okay, thank you for your good question. I think, first of all, the Global South now is it seemed to me, a louder voice to address the interest and which is some sort of essential claims by the developing countries. So then, actually, the U.S. and China could do a lot of things to promote their such a claim and interest. First of all, I see we should just push on more efficiency of global governance. So then, a lot of some sort of such a disputed, interest could be well addressed throughout the international organizations. But any international organizations could ultimately come to any productive, we say consensus. Great power competition is a very essential, some sort of preconditions. That's why I totally assume so U.S. or China should stop just exchange any files over the global south and take the more serious the global south claims as some sort of could shared great powers obligations and pushing on the efficiency of the global governance. Second, I think it's also very important. Then U.S. or China should take a lead in addressing some sort of key concerns. For example, so now just the last month, the 7 international organizations jointly declare what is entering into the new crisis moment of the food and the nutrition. I think it's a really very timely reminder how the world could get out of some sort of possible recessions and expanding, some sort of starvation and social economic unrest. U.S. or China, of course, has a shared obligation to work together and get things well addressed. So then, to be honest, it's also some sort of a very symmetrical, such uncertainties in the world. On the one hand, I see international situation has never been more disruptive since the end of the Second World War. We have a great power rivalry. We have hot wars, just like the Ukraine war now is going on. Then we say Thucydides trap now is also simmering over the world. So then how to get the things well addressed? So then we need some sort of a great power, the cooperation. So that's why I think there's no way Washington and Beijing could just it seemed to me, we say, notch some sort of their obligation to address the world concern. Thank you.
Okay, I think that concludes our conversation today. It was a really invigorating, informative conversation.
We are quite wondering about the Ukrainian conflict. Is any possible issue?
Yeah, of course, Ukraine used to be served as a very pivotal state in Europe to bridge, the intercontinental such connections from China to West Europe. Then China also served a #1 trading partner to Ukraine for years. So now Ukraine is really falling into some sort of very, war-torn, some sort of such a, we say such a very horrible, the fragmentation or warfare is still just put the Ukrainians on the file. I really feel, of course, it's very, very, harmful to the BRI. So then that's why the China's expression of the, suspension of the war fighting and returning to the peaceful talk is not just some sort of the Chinese diplomatic manner. It's a real serve the China's interest at the best. But the problem is, as I mentioned, what kind of the end game the Ukraine crisis will have. So as we discussed, so if the Ukraine war is less manageable, then we will see some sort of such a very disastrous spillover effects, not just to get the entire Europe into the victimization. China's national interest also will be very severely damaged. So BI, particularly intercontinental connection between China and Europe, now is never been more dependable on, as I mentioned, termination of the Ukraine war.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can all see that the conversation we had just now is too lively. We don't want to stop, right? But unfortunately, we got limited time. So I think there is a consensus here that engagement is the key to promoting peace and security, right? And the dialogue that we have today is such a kind of attempt, which is very important, right? So thank you so much to our two esteemed professors, and thank you, Mr. Cole, for organizing such dialogue, and thank you to our audience too. Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, pleasure.